In a universe defined by violence, speed, and indifference, innocence becomes difficult to recognize. In the multiverse of Rick and Morty, danger is often framed as spectacle, and creatures are introduced as obstacles rather than beings. From a distance, monsters appear interchangeable, designed to be fled from, destroyed, or dismissed. Yet when the noise fades and the chaos slows, a different pattern emerges. Many of the creatures encountered are not malicious. They are simply present, living within systems that do not accommodate human fragility or moral expectation. Innocent monsters in this multiverse are not innocent because they are gentle or harmless. They are innocent because they do not choose harm in the way humans understand choice. Their actions follow instinct, biology, or structural necessity. Violence emerges not from intent, but from incompatibility. The tragedy is not that these creatures exist, but that the universe has no space to recognize their neutrality. The multiverse operates without moral framing. It does not label behavior as good or evil. It simply allows outcomes. Within this framework, creatures that cause harm are often treated as threats without context. Their internal logic is irrelevant to survival-focused protagonists. This perspective simplifies interaction, but erases complexity. Innocence becomes invisible when the only metric that matters is danger. Many creatures encountered function as environmental hazards rather than antagonists. They occupy space, follow patterns, and react to intrusion. Their presence is not aggressive in intent, but defensive or habitual. From their perspective, humans are anomalies, unpredictable disruptions rather than victims. The violence that follows is not pursuit, but collision. Two incompatible ways of existing intersect, and damage occurs without malice. This reframing destabilizes the idea of monstrosity. If a creature is only acting according to its nature, then harm becomes an emergent property rather than a moral failure. The universe does not intervene to correct this. It does not provide warnings or translations. It allows misinterpretation to persist because misinterpretation is efficient. In a fast-moving multiverse, understanding is optional. The concept of innocence is further complicated by scale. Many creatures exist at magnitudes that make human life negligible. Their awareness, if it exists at all, does not register individual suffering. This lack of recognition is often mistaken for cruelty. In reality, it is indifference shaped by size, lifespan, or perception. Harm occurs not because it is desired, but because it is unnoticed. This indifference mirrors the multiverse itself. The universe does not target individuals. It allows outcomes to unfold without regard for who is affected. Innocent monsters are extensions of this principle. They are not exceptions to cosmic indifference, but expressions of it. Their existence reveals how morality dissolves when scale expands beyond empathy. What makes these creatures unsettling is not their appearance or power, but their unresponsiveness to human meaning. Fear, pleading, reasoning, and negotiation fail because they are irrelevant within the creature's framework. The monster does not refuse empathy. It does not recognize it as a concept. This absence forces a confrontation with the limits of moral projection. In a violent multiverse, innocence does not protect. It does not function as armor or exemption. Innocent creatures suffer as readily as guilty ones. They are captured, exploited, displaced, or destroyed without distinction. Their lack of intent offers no defense. The universe does not reward moral neutrality. It rewards adaptability and force. This creates an ethical asymmetry. Human characters often justify violence by necessity, framing it as survival rather than aggression. Yet the creatures they encounter operate under the same logic. Survival requires action. Space is defended. Resources are consumed. The difference is not moral orientation, but narrative framing. Humans are centered. Creatures are peripheral. When examined closely, many monsters are victims of the same system that threatens the protagonists. They exist within unstable ecosystems, collapsing timelines, or exploitative structures created by more powerful forces. Their aggression is often a response to disruption rather than an inherent trait. They react to invasion, extraction, or manipulation. The violence that follows is reciprocal, though asymmetrically portrayed. The multiverse encourages this asymmetry by prioritizing motion over reflection. Encounters are brief. Decisions are immediate. There is no pause to consider whether a creature understands what is happening. There is no incentive to explore its internal logic. Survival rewards speed, not comprehension. Innocence becomes collateral. This dynamic reveals a deeper discomfort. Innocent monsters undermine the idea that violence is always deserved. They introduce ambiguity where justification is expected. If a creature is not evil, then destruction becomes ethically unresolved. The universe offers no resolution. It moves on, leaving consequences unexamined. Over time, this accumulation of unresolved harm normalizes indifference. Repeated exposure to innocent suffering dulls response. Creatures become background noise, visual texture rather than moral subjects. The multiverse trains its inhabitants to prioritize momentum over reflection. Innocence becomes an inefficiency, yet traces of discomfort remain. The presence of innocent monsters introduces a quiet tension beneath the spectacle. They linger as reminders that harm is not always corrective or necessary. Their existence complicates the narrative of survival by exposing its cost. Even when ignored, they shape the emotional landscape. These creatures also challenge anthropocentric morality. Human frameworks of intent, guilt, and responsibility do not translate cleanly across species, dimensions, or forms of consciousness. Innocent monsters expose the limits of these frameworks. They reveal that morality is not universal, but contextual, shaped by perception and power. In this way, monsters become mirrors rather than threats. They reflect the assumptions humans bring into unfamiliar environments. The expectation that danger implies malice. The belief that harm requires justification. When these assumptions fail, discomfort arises. Innocent monsters force a reckoning with moral simplicity. The multiverse does not encourage this reckoning. It provides endless distraction, but in quiet moments, the pattern becomes visible. The universe is filled with life that does not align with human values, yet persists regardless. Innocence does not make existence safer. It simply makes harm harder to rationalize. There is also a quiet sadness in how disposable these creatures are. Entire species appear briefly and vanish without acknowledgement. Their extinction or suffering leaves no trace. The universe absorbs it without pause. Innocent monsters do not leave monuments. They leave absence. This disposability mirrors the treatment of many realities within the multiverse. Worlds are abandoned. Timelines are erased. Continuity is optional. Innocent creatures are casualties of this disposability. Their lives are contingent on convenience rather than worth. Despite this, innocence retains a subtle power. It exposes the violence of indifference without needing to oppose it directly. The mere existence of creatures that do not deserve harm but receive it anyway undermines narratives of justified destruction. They introduce moral residue that cannot be fully erased. Innocent monsters also highlight the difference between danger and evil. Danger is a condition. Evil implies intent. The multiverse collapses these distinctions for efficiency, but they remain conceptually important. Recognizing innocence within danger complicates response. It slows reaction. It introduces hesitation. This hesitation is rare, but meaningful. It represents a moment where survival logic is interrupted by reflection. The multiverse does not reward such moments, but they persist. They appear as discomfort, as unease, as quiet questioning that lingers after the encounter ends. Ultimately, innocent monsters reveal that violence in the multiverse is often impersonal. It is not driven by hatred or cruelty, but by structural incompatibility. Worlds overlap without shared language or values. Harm emerges from collision rather than intention. Innocence does not prevent this. It only clarifies its tragedy. From this perspective, the multiverse is not hostile so much as unaccommodating. It does not adjust for vulnerability. It does not translate between forms of life. Innocent monsters suffer not because they are targeted, but because they are unprotected by narrative importance. Their presence reframes the idea of monstrosity itself. Monsters are not defined by what they do, but by how they are perceived. Innocence does not alter perception when survival is at stake. The label persists regardless of accuracy. In a violent multiverse, innocence becomes quiet, fragile, and easily erased. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It exists briefly, often unnoticed, before being consumed by larger forces. This does not make it meaningless. It makes it vulnerable. What lingers is the recognition that harm does not require hatred, and innocence does not guarantee safety. The multiverse operates beyond moral alignment. Innocent monsters exist within it, not as contradictions, but as confirmations of its indifference. And in acknowledging them, even briefly, the violence of the system becomes clearer. Not louder, not more dramatic, but more honest. Innocent monster also reveal how quickly perception hardens under pressure. When survival is prioritized, ambiguity becomes a liability. The multiverse rewards fast categorization, not careful interpretation. Anything unfamiliar is sorted into threat or obstacle. And once that label is applied, it rarely changes. Innocence does not register because it requires time, and time is scarce. The system favors decisiveness over accuracy. This dynamic reshapes how creatures are encountered. First contact is almost never neutral. It is framed by intrusion, pursuit, or defense. The creature appears already contextualized as a problem to be solved. Its internal state is irrelevant. Its history is inaccessible. Innocence, if present, exists entirely outside the frame. What matters is whether it interferes with movement. Over repeated encounters, this framing becomes habitual. Creatures are no longer evaluated individually. They are processed as types. Species become shorthand for danger levels. Visual design substitutes for moral assessment. The multiverse trains its inhabitants to respond to appearance rather than intention. Once this habit forms, innocence becomes indistinguishable from hostility. This process mirrors real-world mechanisms of dehumanization, scaled to the cosmic level. Complexity is reduced to function. Difference is equated with threat. Innocent monsters are not actively hated. They are simply unconsidered. Their suffering does not provoke outrage because it never enters awareness as suffering. It registers as background consequence. The speed of the multiverse intensifies this effect. Encounters are brief and overwhelming. There is rarely an opportunity to observe creatures outside moments of conflict. No one stays long enough to see how they behave when unprovoked. Their lives unfold off-screen, unexamined. Innocence exists primarily in absence, inferred rather than witnessed. This absence creates a moral blind spot. Without sustained observation, creatures are defined entirely by how they intersect with human goals. If they obstruct, they are enemies. If they assist, they are tools. Innocent monsters often fall into the first category simply by existing in inconvenient places. Their neutrality is functionally irrelevant. The multiverse also destabilizes accountability. When harm occurs, responsibility diffuses across systems. Who is at fault when a creature reacts defensively to invasion? Who bears responsibility when ecosystems collapse due to technological interference? The scale of cause and effect makes attribution difficult. Innocent monsters suffer within this ambiguity. Their harm absorbed into a web of indirect causation. This diffusion benefits those with power. When no single actor is clearly responsible, violence becomes normalized. It is framed as unavoidable rather than chosen. Innocent monsters become casualties of inevitability rather than victims of decision-making. The narrative shifts from ethics to logistics. The idea of inevitability is central here. The multiverse presents violence as a natural outcome of scale and diversity. Different forms of life cannot coexist without conflict. This framing suggests that harm is built into existence itself. Innocent monsters are unfortunate, but not wronged. Their suffering is treated as a byproduct rather than an injustice. This framing discourages reflection. If harm is inevitable, then examining it becomes pointless. The multiverse encourages acceptance rather than critique. Innocent monsters fade into the background as examples of unfortunate necessity. Their presence becomes another data point, supporting the belief that the universe cannot be gentle. Yet this belief is not neutral. It shapes behavior. When violence is expected, restraint feels naive. Compassion feels inefficient. Innocent monsters challenge this expectation by existing without hostility. They expose the assumption that danger must be intentional. Their presence introduces a crack in the narrative of inevitability. This crack is uncomfortable. It raises questions that the multiverse does not answer. Could encounters be different with more time? With translation? With restraint? The system does not explore these possibilities. It moves forward. Innocent monsters linger as unresolved questions rather than catalysts for change. The persistence of these unresolved questions creates a quiet tension beneath the spectacle. Even when ignored, they influence tone. The world feels harsher, not because monsters are evil, but because innocence offers no protection. This undermines the idea that morality has structural power. Goodness does not alter outcomes at scale. Innocent monsters also reveal how survival logic can become self-justifying. Violence is framed as response. Response becomes habit. Habit becomes identity. Over time, the distinction between defense and aggression blurs. Creatures are preemptively neutralized to avoid risk. Innocence becomes irrelevant because threat is assumed in advance. This preemption is efficient but corrosive. It trains characters to act without verification. Innocent monsters are casualties of this efficiency. They are harmed not because they pose danger, but because they might have. Potential replaces reality as justification. The multiverse reinforces this logic through repetition. Rarely does restraint produce visible reward. Often it produces vulnerability. The system selects against caution. Innocent monsters, when spared, do not guarantee safety. This reinforces the belief that mercy is impractical. Over time, this belief hardens into norm. Despite this, innocence continues to surface. Not loudly, but persistently. A creature hesitates instead of attacking. A being reacts with confusion rather than aggression. These moments are brief, easily dismissed, but they disrupt expectation. They suggest that violence is not the only possible response, even in hostile environments. These disruptions do not alter the system, but they register emotionally. They create dissonance between action and justification. When an innocent creature is harmed, the narrative does not provide closure. The event lingers as unease rather than lesson. The multiverse does not resolve moral tension. It accumulates it. This accumulation contributes to emotional fatigue. Repeated exposure to unjustified harm without resolution erodes clarity. Innocent monsters become part of a background sadness that is never addressed directly. Their suffering is neither mourned nor acknowledged. It simply becomes part of the environment. The lack of mourning is significant. Mourning implies recognition of loss. The multiverse rarely pauses long enough for this recognition. Innocent monsters die without ceremony. Their absence is not marked. This absence reinforces disposability. Life that is not central to the narrative is treated as expendable. This disposability extends beyond monsters. It applies to worlds, timelines, and entire civilizations. Innocent monsters are one expression of a broader pattern. They reveal how value is assigned based on relevance rather than inherent worth. The multiverse does not measure value ethically. It measures it narratively. Narrative centrality determines survival. Innocent monsters lack this centrality. They are peripheral by design. Their stories are not told, their perspectives are not explored. This absence makes harm easier to accept. Without narrative investment, loss feels abstract. Yet the very presence of monsters, innocent or otherwise, hints at unseen narratives. Every creature implies a history, an ecology, a way of being. The multiverse contains more stories than it tells. Innocent monsters represent this excess of untold life. Their existence suggests that the universe is fuller than the narrative allows. This excess is unsettling. It implies that harm is occurring constantly, beyond awareness. Innocent monsters suffer not in isolated incidents, but as part of a continuous process. The multiverse absorbs this suffering without acknowledgement. Its scale allows it to contain infinite tragedy without change. Recognizing innocent monsters, even abstractly, challenges complacency. It introduces the idea that harm is not always justified by necessity. It suggests that alternatives might exist, even if they are not explored. This recognition does not demand action, it demands awareness. Awareness, however, is costly. It slows response. It complicates decision-making. In a system that rewards speed, awareness becomes a disadvantage. Innocent monsters persist at the margins because acknowledging them would require structural change. The multiverse avoids this cost by maintaining indifference. The creatures themselves do not protest. They do not frame their suffering as injustice. They simply exist until they do not. Their innocence is passive. It does not confront violence directly. This passivity makes it easy to overlook, but it also makes it undeniable when noticed. Innocent monsters are not moral arguments. They are conditions. They reveal what happens when life is abundant and value is selective. They show how harm can occur without cruelty and how suffering can exist without villainy. This complicates simplistic moral frameworks. The multiverse thrives on simplification. Heroes and threats, problems and solutions. Innocent monsters resist this structure. They are problems without blame, threats without malice. Their existence introduces moral noise into a system that prefers clarity. This noise is rarely amplified. It remains background hum. But over time, it shapes the atmosphere. The universe feels colder not because monsters are worse, but because innocence is ineffective. The realization that goodness does not scale introduces a quiet despair. Yet within this despair, there is also honesty. Innocent monsters strip away comforting illusions. They show that morality is not enforced by the universe. It must be chosen locally without guarantee. The multiverse does not support this choice. It merely allows it. In this context, innocence is not a shield, it is a vulnerability. Innocent monsters embody this vulnerability. Their existence makes visible the cost of indifference without demanding resolution. They remain as quiet witnesses to a system that does not pause. Ultimately, innocent monsters reveal the true nature of violence in the multiverse. It is not fueled by hatred or cruelty alone. It is sustained by speed, scale, and disregard. Harm happens because there is no time to ask whether it should. Their presence reframes monstrosity itself. Monsters are not defined by innocence or guilt, but by how easily they can be ignored. Innocent monsters are those whose suffering does not disrupt momentum. They exist until they interfere, and then they are removed. This is not framed as tragedy. It is framed as necessity. The multiverse moves on. Innocent monsters fade into absence. Their stories remain untold. What lingers is the recognition that violence does not require evil to persist. It requires only indifference and motion. Innocent monsters exist as evidence of this truth. They do not accuse. They do not resist. They simply reveal. And in revealing it, they quietly reshape how the violent multiverse is understood, not as a place where monsters must be defeated, but as a place where innocence is rarely enough to matter. Innocent monsters also expose how easily empathy becomes conditional when environments are hostile. In the multiverse, empathy is not framed as a default response, but as a risk. To empathize requires slowing down, observing, and remaining open to uncertainty. These actions increase vulnerability. As a result, empathy is often postponed indefinitely, waiting for a safer moment that never arrives. Innocent monsters exist in this postponement, always slightly out of reach of consideration. Hostility compresses perception. When danger is assumed, nuance disappears. Creatures are read through the narrow lens of threat assessment. Size, movement, sound, and unfamiliarity dominate interpretation. Innocence has no visual shorthand. There is no immediate signal that communicates harmlessness across species or dimensions. Without such signals, empathy has no entry point. Innocent monsters remain unreadable, and unreadable beings are treated as hazards. The multiverse amplifies this effect by overwhelming sensory input. Encounters are loud, fast, and disorienting. In these conditions, subtle cues are lost. A creature's hesitation, confusion, or non-aggressive behavior is easily missed. The environment itself conspires against recognition. Innocence requires attention, and attention is scarce. This scarcity is not accidental. The multiverse rewards efficiency. It favors solutions that minimize time spent in uncertainty. Quick judgments reduce cognitive load. They allow movement to continue. Innocent monsters slow this process. Acknowledging their innocence complicates decision-making. It introduces ethical friction into situations that demand speed. The system selects against this friction. Over time, this selection shapes behavior. Characters become skilled at ignoring complexity. They learn to treat ambiguity as noise rather than information. Innocent monsters become part of that noise. Their presence does not register as morally significant because significance itself has been redefined. What matters is what threatens progress. Progress in this context is not moral or narrative progress. It is literal movement, escaping danger, completing objectives, advancing through space. Innocent monsters often exist in the way of this movement. Their habitats overlap with transit routes. Their bodies occupy space that must be crossed. Their survival is secondary to momentum. This framing transforms coexistence into obstruction. Innocent monsters are not attacked because they are enemies, but because they are in the way. Violence becomes infrastructural rather than emotional. It is a means of clearing paths, not expressing hostility. This makes harm feel impersonal and therefore easier to justify. The impersonality of this harm is crucial. When violence lacks emotional charge, it feels neutral. Innocent monsters are destroyed without anger, fear, or satisfaction. The act is procedural. This procedural violence is more disturbing than overt cruelty because it lacks any internal resistance. It does not even recognize itself as violence. The multiverse normalizes this procedure through repetition. Encounters follow similar patterns. Creatures appear, interfere, are removed. The rhythm becomes familiar. Familiarity dulls response. Innocent monsters are folded into routine. Their destruction feels no different from bypassing a broken tool or avoiding a malfunctioning system. This routinization erases moral contrast. When harm becomes routine, innocence loses distinction. Everything blends into operational necessity. The idea that some beings might not deserve harm becomes abstract, detached from action. Innocent monsters become conceptual rather than experiential. Yet the system is not airtight. Moments of dissonance occur. A creature reacts in an unexpected way. A being does not attack when anticipated. These moments disrupt the routine. They introduce a pause, however brief. In that pause, innocence becomes visible. Not as a trait, but as a possibility. These possibilities are fleeting. The system quickly reasserts itself. Movement resumes, the moment passes, but it leaves a residue, a sense that something was misread. That harm occurred without full understanding. This residue accumulates over time, contributing to a subtle unease that permeates the multiverse. This unease is rarely articulated. There is no framework for processing it. The multiverse does not provide moral debriefings. It does not encourage reflection on collateral damage. Innocent monsters contribute to a background discomfort that has no outlet. It exists as tension without expression. The lack of expression is significant. Without articulation, discomfort cannot become critique. It remains diffuse. Innocent monsters are not remembered individually. They blur together. Their suffering is not denied, but it is not integrated into decision-making. It becomes emotional static. This static affects tone. The universe feels harsher, not because violence increases, but because meaning decreases. When harm lacks justification and resolution, it feels heavier. Innocent monsters amplify this weight. They reveal that violence is not always purposeful. Sometimes it is simply the cost of operating within an indifferent system. The system's indifference is not malicious. It does not target innocence. It does not seek harm. It simply does not adjust for vulnerability. Innocent monsters suffer because the system is not designed to protect them. Their existence highlights this design flaw. This flaw is structural. The multiverse prioritizes adaptability, not care. Creatures that survive are those that can respond aggressively, hide effectively, or avoid contact. Innocent monsters often lack these traits. Their survival strategies may be incompatible with the dominant modes of interaction. As a result, they are selected against. This selection is not intentional, but it is consistent. Over time, the multiverse becomes populated by beings that can withstand hostility. Innocent monsters disappear not because they are wrong, but because they are unsuited to the prevailing conditions. This creates a feedback loop. The universe becomes harsher because only the harsh survive. In this context, innocence is not just vulnerable, It is maladaptive. This is perhaps the most unsettling implication. Innocent monsters are not merely unlucky. They represent forms of life that cannot persist in an environment structured around speed, conflict, and indifference. Their extinction is not dramatic. It is gradual and unnoticed. This unnoticed loss reshapes the emotional ecology of the universe. Without innocent creatures, encounters become more predictably hostile. Suspicion feels justified. Preemptive violence feels rational. The absence of innocence reinforces the belief that danger is universal. Innocent monsters, when present, contradict this belief. Their disappearance strengthens it. The multiverse thus becomes self-confirming. It produces conditions that eliminate innocence, and then uses the absence of innocence to justify continued aggression. Innocent monsters are casualties of this cycle. Their brief appearances are anomalies that are quickly resolved through removal. Yet the memory of these anomalies persists, even if indistinctly. They linger as impressions rather than narratives, a sense that not everything encountered deserved destruction. This sense does not change behavior, but it complicates it. It introduces hesitation without instruction. Hesitation is dangerous in the multiverse. It slows response. It increases risk. As a result, hesitation is often suppressed. Characters learn to override it. Innocent monsters become associated with danger not because they attack, but because they provoke doubt. Doubt is framed as liability. This framing reveals how the system values certainty over correctness. Acting quickly, even if wrongly, is preferred to acting slowly with care. Innocent monsters suffer under this preference. Their innocence requires verification. Verification takes time. Time is costly. The cost of time is reinforced narratively. Moments of hesitation are punished. Caution leads to complication. Mercy leads to vulnerability. The multiverse teaches through consequence. Innocent monsters are positioned as lessons in inefficiency rather than reminders of ethical complexity. This lesson is internalized. Over time, characters become less inclined to pause. Innocent monsters are encountered less as moral challenges and more as confirmation that hesitation is dangerous. Their suffering becomes evidence that the universe cannot afford gentleness. Yet this conclusion is not entirely stable. It conflicts with the emotional residue left by unresolved harm. Innocent monsters leave behind discomfort that does not dissipate. This discomfort suggests that something is being lost, even if the system continues to function. The loss is not just individual creatures. It is the possibility of coexistence. Innocent monsters represent alternative modes of being that do not rely on aggression. Their elimination narrows the range of life the universe can support. The multiverse becomes less diverse emotionally as well as biologically. This narrowing has consequences. When only aggressive or resilient forms persist, interactions become more predictable but also more brutal. Surprise diminishes. Curiosity fades. The universe becomes efficient but empty of gentler variation. Innocent monsters are part of what makes the multiverse feel alive, rather than merely operational. Their absence contributes to a sense of hollowness. Worlds feel less inhabited, even when populated. Life exists, but it feels hardened. Innocence introduces softness that contrasts with violence. Without it, everything feels uniformly sharp. This sharpness is not celebrated explicitly. It is simply accepted. The multiverse does not mourn what it loses. It adapts. Innocent monsters vanish and the universe continues. This continuation is not proof of correctness. It is proof of momentum. Momentum replaces meaning. Movement replaces reflection. Innocent monsters slow both. Their removal restores flow. The system prefers flow. It is optimized for it. Yet optimization comes at a cost that is not immediately visible. The cost is emotional depth. Innocent monsters add layers to experience. They complicate encounters. They force reconsideration. Without them, the universe becomes flatter, even as it remains vast. This flattening affects perception. Everything begins to feel similar. Threats blur together. Worlds lose distinction. Innocent monsters once provided contrast. Their uniqueness broke patterns. Their removal increases monotony. Monotony is not safety. It is predictability. Predictability allows survival, but not richness. Innocent monsters contribute to richness by introducing non-hostile difference. Their presence suggests that not all unfamiliar life is dangerous. Their absence reinforces suspicion. Suspicion becomes default. Innocent monsters challenge this default simply by existing. They do not need to act. Their mere presence questions assumptions. This is why they are unsettling. They destabilize certainty without offering solutions. The multiverse does not tolerate destabilization well. It resolves uncertainty through force. Innocent monsters are resolved in this way. Their stories end quickly, not because they are unimportant, but because they are inconvenient. Inconvenience is a powerful filter. It determines which lives are allowed to persist. Innocent monsters fail this filter. They require accommodation. Accommodation slows systems. The multiverse avoids it. Yet the need for accommodation does not disappear. It reappears as absence, a sense that something is missing, a feeling that the universe is more hostile than it needs to be. Innocent monsters leave behind this feeling when they are gone. This feeling does not change the multiverse. It changes how it is experienced. The violence feels less justified, even if it remains unavoidable. Innocent monsters introduce moral ambiguity that lingers beyond their presence. They do not offer redemption. They do not reform systems. They simply reveal. They show that harm can occur without hatred, and that survival can erase innocence without noticing. In doing so, they clarify the nature of violence in the multiverse. It is not driven solely by evil intent. It is sustained by structure, speed, and selective attention. Innocent monsters exist at the edges of this structure, briefly visible before being absorbed. Their significance lies not in what they do, but in what they reveal. They expose the limits of empathy under pressure. They show how quickly innocence becomes invisible when survival is prioritized. They demonstrate that a universe can be violent without being cruel. This distinction does not lessen the harm, it deepens it. Violence without cruelty offers no villain to confront, no motive to challenge. It is harder to resist because it is impersonal. Innocent monsters suffer within this impersonal violence, unnoticed and unremembered. In the end, they are not symbols of hope or condemnation. They are indicators. They indicate how the multiverse operates when left unchecked by reflection. They show what is lost when efficiency overrides care. In a violent multiverse, innocence does not endure. It flickers briefly and disappears. What remains is motion, structure, and continuation. Innocent monsters remind us, quietly and without accusation, that continuation alone is not the same as justice. And that reminder, though easily ignored, changes how the violence is understood, not as a battle between good and evil, but as a system that does not slow down long enough to notice what it destroys. Innocent monsters also illuminate how language fails in the multiverse. Harm often begins long before violence, at the point where description replaces understanding. Creatures are named, categorized, and reduced to shorthand. Labels simplify navigation through chaos, but they also flatten reality. Once a being is named a monster, its inner logic becomes irrelevant. Innocence cannot survive the efficiency of naming. This linguistic compression is not malicious, it is practical. The multiverse overwhelms perception with variety. To function within it, inhabitants rely on abstraction. A creature becomes a type. A type becomes a risk profile. This process saves time, but it removes specificity. Innocent monsters are casualties of abstraction. Their individuality disappears into category. Abstraction also removes temporal depth. Creatures are encountered in moments of conflict, not within the continuity of their lives. There is no sense of before or after. A being exists only in the instant it intersects with human movement. Innocence requires duration to be visible. Without time, it cannot emerge. The multiverse rarely provides time. The absence of time reshapes judgment. Decisions are made without context, because context is inaccessible. Innocent monsters are judged solely by immediate impact. Their history, social structure, and survival strategies are invisible. This invisibility turns harm into a technical problem rather than a moral one. The universe proceeds as if nothing essential has been lost. This approach affects perception at a deeper level. When harm is framed as technical, emotional response becomes optional. Feelings are treated as noise that interferes with action. Innocent monsters, whose presence evokes uncertainty rather than clear threat, produce emotional interference. The system learns to suppress that interference quickly. Suppression does not eliminate emotion. It displaces it. Unprocessed responses accumulate as low-level tension. Innocent monsters contribute to this accumulation. Each unresolved encounter adds weight to an already heavy atmosphere. The multiverse does not collapse under this weight. It absorbs it. Those moving through it feel the strain without clear cause. This strain manifests as fatigue rather than guilt. Guilt implies responsibility. Fatigue implies endurance. Innocent monsters shift the emotional cost of violence from moral reckoning to exhaustion. The harm is felt but not examined. Over time, this produces numbness that feels earned rather than chosen. Numbness is not the absence of feeling. It is the narrowing of response. Innocent monsters fall outside this narrowed range. They provoke responses that do not fit established patterns. As a result, those responses are truncated. The feeling begins, recognizes its incompatibility, and fades. Innocence registers briefly and then disappears. The multiverse reinforces this fading by refusing to linger. There are no consequences that point back to the encounter. No echoes, no returns. Worlds move on. Timelines branch. The creature's absence does not disrupt flow. Innocent monsters vanish without creating narrative friction. This lack of friction is significant. Friction slows systems. It demands adjustment. Innocent monsters create potential friction by complicating encounters. Their removal restores smoothness. The multiverse prioritizes smoothness over accuracy. Violence becomes a lubricant rather than a rupture. Smoothness, however, comes at the cost of depth. When encounters are frictionless, they are forgettable. Innocent monsters disappear not only physically, but cognitively. Their absence leaves no trace. This forgettability compounds the harm. It ensures that patterns repeat without learning. Repetition without learning is a defining feature of the multiverse. Encounters recur in slightly altered forms. Each time, the system responds similarly. Innocent monsters reappear, are misread, and are removed. The cycle persists because nothing interrupts it. Awareness does not accumulate. It dissipates. This dissipation reveals a paradox. The multiverse contains infinite variation, yet behavior remains rigid. Diversity of form does not translate into diversity of response. Innocent monsters highlight this rigidity. They demonstrate that difference alone does not generate curiosity. It often generates threat assessment instead. Threat assessment is reductive by design. It strips away nuance to produce quick decisions. Innocent monsters resist this reduction because their threat level is ambiguous. Ambiguity is destabilizing. The system resolves it through force. This resolution is final and unexamined. The unexamined nature of this resolution is what gives innocent monsters their quiet significance. They expose the cost of unexamined action. They show how harm can be normalized without justification. They exist at the intersection of indifference and urgency, where reflection is always deferred. Deferral becomes habit. Reflection is postponed until conditions are safer. Safer conditions never arrive. Innocent monsters remain perpetually unexamined. Their innocence is not denied. It is deferred out of existence. This deferral affects how morality functions. Morality becomes situational rather than principled. It is applied when convenient and suspended when costly. Innocent monsters suffer during suspension. Their presence tests the integrity of moral frameworks. The system responds by bypassing the test. Bypassing does not resolve contradiction. It conceals it. Innocent monsters create contradictions that are hidden beneath momentum. The universe continues without reconciling them. This unresolved tension contributes to a sense that something is fundamentally misaligned, even if it cannot be articulated. The misalignment is between power and care. The multiverse has immense power to traverse, manipulate, and destroy. It has little capacity for care. Innocent monsters reveal this imbalance. They show how easily power operates without consideration, and how rarely care influences outcome. Care requires recognition. Recognition requires time and attention. Both are scarce. Innocent monsters exist in the gap between encounter and recognition. They pass through without being fully seen. This partial visibility is enough to disturb, but not enough to protect. Protection in the multiverse is selective. It is afforded to what is central, useful, or adaptable. Innocent monsters often lack these qualities. They are peripheral. Their survival does not serve larger objectives. As a result, they are expendable. Expendability is not framed as cruelty. It is framed as necessity. The universe does not mourn what it does not count. Innocent monsters are not counted. Their loss does not register as deficit. The system continues unchanged. Yet the presence of expendable life alters atmosphere. A universe where innocence offers no shelter feels colder. This coldness is not emotional. It is structural. It arises from the knowledge that value is conditional. Innocent monsters make this condition visible. They also reveal the fragility of ethical intent. Good intentions cannot operate effectively without supportive structures. Individuals may hesitate, feel discomfort, or question harm. These impulses rarely translate into altered outcomes. Innocent monsters show how ethics can exist without efficacy. This inefficacy is demoralizing. It suggests that caring does not matter. Over time, this belief can erode motivation to care. Innocent monsters contribute to this erosion by repeatedly demonstrating that innocence does not change fate. Despite this, traces of care persist. They appear as discomfort, as hesitation, as moments of quiet unease. Innocent monsters leave behind these traces. They do not transform the system, but they affect those who notice them. The effect is subtle and cumulative. Cumulative effects shape perception even when unacknowledged. The multiverse may not slow, but experience deepens. Innocent monsters add layers of unease that alter how violence is felt. It becomes heavier, less justified, more mechanical. Mechanical violence lacks narrative satisfaction. It does not resolve tension. It creates it. Innocent monsters intensify this tension by removing clear antagonism. When harm lacks a villain, it becomes harder to process. The system does not provide tools for this processing. Without tools, individuals adapt by narrowing emotional range. Innocent monsters fall outside this narrowed range. They are felt briefly and then excluded. This exclusion protects functionality, but impoverishes experience. The universe becomes navigable but less meaningful. Meaning in the multiverse is often tied to agency. Innocent monsters lack agency in encounters. They do not choose confrontation. They are encountered and removed. Their lack of agency highlights the asymmetry of power. This asymmetry undermines narratives of fair conflict. Fair conflict implies choice on both sides. Innocent monsters do not choose to be threats. They are framed as such. This framing justifies harm without accountability. The system absolves itself by treating harm as unavoidable. Unavoidability becomes a moral shield. If harm cannot be avoided, it need not be examined. Innocent monsters challenge this shield by suggesting that harm might be avoidable with different priorities. The system ignores this suggestion because it threatens efficiency. Efficiency dominates because it ensures survival. Survival becomes the highest value. Innocent monsters expose the cost of this hierarchy. When survival overrides all else, innocence becomes irrelevant. Life persists, but meaning thins. This thinning is not immediately apparent. The multiverse remains visually rich, full of novelty and movement. Innocent monsters affect depth rather than surface. They reduce the density of meaning without altering appearance. The universe looks the same, but feels emptier. Emptiness here does not mean lack of content, it means lack of resonance. Encounters do not linger, they pass through without imprint. Innocent monsters could have created resonance by complicating encounters. Their removal ensures smooth passage. Smooth passage is valued because it minimizes friction. Friction is associated with danger. Innocent monsters introduce friction by raising questions. The system resolves this by eliminating the source of friction. Questions vanish with the creatures that provoke them. This resolution is efficient but incomplete. It does not answer the questions. It removes them. Innocent monsters become silenced inquiries. Their absence leaves behind unasked questions that subtly haunt the system. These unasked questions shape atmosphere. They create a sense that violence is excessive even when necessary, that harm is disproportionate even when justified. Innocent monsters contribute to this sense by existing briefly and disappearing without explanation. Explanation would require slowing down. Slowing down would require rethinking priorities. The multiverse resists this. It maintains momentum by avoiding reflection. Innocent monsters exist as casualties of this avoidance. Avoidance is easier than confrontation. Confronting the existence of innocent monsters would require acknowledging that harm is not always justified. It would require accepting responsibility for structural violence. The multiverse does not engage in this acceptance. Structural violence operates without intent. It is built into dynamics. Innocent monsters reveal this by suffering without being targeted. They are harmed by processes rather than decisions. This makes harm harder to oppose. There is no enemy to confront, only structure to navigate. Navigating structure prioritizes adaptation over resistance. Innocent monsters often cannot adapt quickly enough. Their forms, behaviors, or needs do not align with dominant patterns. They are eliminated not for wrongdoing, but for incompatibility. Incompatibility is a neutral term that conceals loss. It frames extinction as mismatch rather than tragedy. Innocent monsters disappear due to incompatibility. The universe continues without marking the loss. This lack of marking is what makes innocent monsters haunting. They leave no memorial. Their absence is total. The only trace is a subtle shift in tone. The universe becomes slightly harsher, slightly less varied. Over time, these shifts accumulate. The multiverse becomes a place where hostility feels normal and gentleness feels anomalous. Innocent monsters once represented gentler possibilities. Their disappearance reinforces the belief that such possibilities are unrealistic. This belief shapes expectation. When gentleness appears, it is treated with suspicion. Innocent monsters, when encountered, are doubted. Their innocence is not trusted. The system expects betrayal because experience has taught that survival requires skepticism. Skepticism becomes default. Innocent monsters challenge skepticism by existing without deception. Their existence creates cognitive dissonance. The system resolves dissonance by eliminating the anomaly. Skepticism remains intact. This process ensures continuity, but prevents growth. Innocent monsters could have expanded the range of interaction. Their removal preserves existing patterns. The multiverse remains stable but stagnant in its ethical orientation. Stagnation does not halt movement. It freezes values. Innocent monsters reveal this freeze by failing to alter response. No matter how many times innocence appears, behavior remains unchanged. The system is resilient to moral input. This resilience is not strength, it is rigidity. Innocent monsters expose rigidity by failing to penetrate it. Their repeated erasure demonstrates that the system does not learn from gentleness. Learning requires feedback. Innocent monsters provide feedback in the form of discomfort. The system does not register this feedback because it lacks mechanisms for integrating it. Discomfort dissipates without effect. Without integration, cycles repeat. Innocent monsters reappear, are misread, and disappear. The multiverse continues. The pattern holds. What changes is perception. Over time, the recognition that innocence does not matter at scale becomes internalized. This recognition alters how violence is felt. It becomes less shocking, more procedural. Innocent monsters contribute to this shift by normalizing unjustified harm. Yet normalization does not equal acceptance. Beneath procedure, unease remains. Innocent monsters ensure that violence never feels entirely clean. There is always residue. This residue does not stop action, but it complicates memory. Memory in the multiverse is fragmented. Innocent monsters are remembered as impressions rather than stories. A sense of something wrong without details. This vagueness makes it easy to move on, but hard to forget entirely. The inability to forget entirely is significant. It suggests that innocence leaves a mark even when erased. Innocent monsters affect the emotional texture of the universe. They make it heavier, more ambivalent. Ambivalence is uncomfortable. It resists resolution. The multiverse tolerates ambivalence by ignoring it. Innocent monsters persist at the edges of awareness, unresolved and unacknowledged. They do not demand justice. They do not inspire rebellion. They simply exist as evidence. Evidence that harm does not require malice, that innocence does not confer safety, that systems can be violent without being evil. This evidence reframes violence. It becomes less about conflict and more about process. Innocent monsters suffer not because someone hates them, but because the system does not account for them. Accounting would require change. Change would require slowing down. The multiverse does not slow. So innocent monsters remain what they are, brief presences in a violent flow, revealing the cost of momentum without interrupting it. Their significance lies not in altering outcomes, but in altering understanding. They show that the multiverse is not cruel because it hates innocence, but because it does not notice it. And in that absence of notice, violence persists without reflection. This is what innocent monsters ultimately reveal. Not a moral lesson to be applied, but a condition to be recognized. The multiverse moves forward. Innocence falls behind. What remains is the quiet knowledge that gentleness exists briefly and disappears not because it is wrong, but because it is unprotected. Innocent monsters also reveal how survival logic reshapes memory itself. When encounters are framed purely as obstacles overcome, what is remembered is efficiency rather than encounter. The details that might suggest innocence are the first to be discarded. Expressions, hesitation, retreat, confusion, these are not useful for future navigation, so they fade. What remains is the simplified lesson. This kind of creature equals danger. Memory becomes optimized, not accurate. This optimization affects how future encounters are approached. Each new creature is preloaded with assumptions derived from incomplete recollection. Innocence never has a chance to present itself because the outcome is already decided. The multiverse encourages this preloading because it reduces uncertainty. Innocent monsters suffer from inherited misinterpretation. They are not judged on their own behavior, but on the memory residue of unrelated encounters. The erosion of accurate memory creates a feedback loop. Violence reinforces expectation. Expectation reinforces violence. Innocent monsters exist briefly within this loop before being erased by it. Their presence does not disrupt the cycle because it is too fleeting to register as correction. The system does not update, it repeats. Repetition without correction produces emotional flattening. When outcomes are predictable, reactions become muted. Innocent monsters do not provoke shock or curiosity. They provoke routine response. This routinization is emotionally protective, but ethically hollow. It allows action without engagement. Over time, engagement itself begins to feel unnecessary. This sense of unnecessary engagement extends beyond monsters. It affects how all unfamiliar life is treated. Curiosity is replaced by categorization. Attention is replaced by scanning. Innocent monsters reveal this shift by highlighting what is missing rather than what is present. Their innocence is not confronted, it is bypassed. The bypassing is subtle. It does not announce itself as a decision. It occurs at the level of perception. A creature is noticed just long enough to be classified and avoided or eliminated. There is no pause in which innocence could become meaningful. The moment passes, and with it, the possibility of a different response. The multiverse makes this bypass feel rational. There is always another threat, another anomaly, another collapse. Attention is a scarce resource, and the system teaches that it must be conserved. Innocent monsters require attention without offering clear benefit. They are inefficient uses of focus. The system reallocates attention elsewhere. This reallocation has consequences. When attention is consistently diverted away from innocence, sensitivity diminishes. The ability to recognize non-hostile difference weakens. Innocent monsters become harder to perceive over time, even when present. They are filtered out preemptively by expectation. Expectation becomes the dominant lens. The multiverse is experienced not as it is, but as it is anticipated to be. Innocent monsters disrupt this anticipation, but only briefly. The system absorbs the disruption by treating it as anomaly rather than signal. The underlying expectation remains intact. This persistence of expectation reveals how resistant systems are to moral input. Innocent monsters provide information that could alter behavior, but the system lacks mechanisms for integrating that information. It prioritizes continuity over learning. The multiverse does not evolve ethically. It stabilizes operationally. Operational stability does not require justice. It requires predictability. Innocent monsters undermine predictability by introducing ambiguity. Their removal restores it. The system selects for predictability even when it is built on misinterpretation. Innocence is sacrificed to maintain coherence. This sacrifice is not acknowledged as such. It is framed as collateral, necessity, or inevitability. The language of inevitability is particularly effective. It absolves action of responsibility by attributing harm to circumstance. Innocent monsters are casualties of circumstance rather than victims of choice. Yet circumstance is shaped by choice at scale. The design of systems, the prioritization of speed, the devaluation of reflection, these are not natural laws. They are constructed. Innocent monsters expose the consequences of these constructions. Their suffering is evidence of design limitations rather than unavoidable fate. This evidence is uncomfortable because it implicates structure rather than individuals. There is no villain to confront, no malicious intent to condemn. Innocent monsters suffer because the system is indifferent, not cruel. Indifference is harder to oppose because it lacks clear motivation. Opposing indifference would require redesign. It would require slowing processes, reallocating attention, and valuing care alongside survival. The multiverse does not support such redesign. It is built to expand, not to pause. Innocent monsters are incompatible with this architecture. Architecture shapes behavior invisibly. Those moving through the multiverse do not wake up intending to ignore innocence. They respond to constraints, time pressure, sensory overload, constant threat. Innocent monsters are filtered out not by conscious rejection, but by environmental demand. This environmental demand normalizes harm. When harm is expected, it loses moral salience. Innocent monsters become part of the expected background. Their presence does not trigger alarm or reflection. It triggers procedure. Procedure replaces judgment. Judgment requires evaluation. Evaluation requires comparison and context. Innocent monsters lack context within the moment of encounter. They are encountered as isolated events, not as parts of ongoing lives. Without context, judgment defaults to safety protocols. Innocence remains invisible. The invisibility of innocence has cumulative effects. Over time, it reshapes how violence is understood. Violence becomes something that happens rather than something that is done. Agency diffuses. Innocent monsters are harmed, but no one feels directly responsible. The harm feels ambient. Ambient harm is difficult to resist. It is not tied to specific decisions. It is embedded in flow. Innocent monsters suffer within this flow, and their suffering does not interrupt it. The multiverse continues to function, reinforcing the belief that nothing essential has been lost. Yet something is lost. What is lost is the possibility of different interaction. Innocent monsters represent alternate modes of coexistence that are never explored. Their elimination forecloses paths that might have led to less violence. The system does not register these lost possibilities. Possibility requires imagination. Imagination requires slack, time, safety, and curiosity. The multiverse offers little slack. Innocent monsters exist in the margins, where slack might briefly appear. Their presence hints at what could be, but the system does not dwell there. Dwelling is discouraged. Movement is rewarded. Innocent monsters slow movement by complicating decisions. The system resolves this by removing the complication. The creature disappears, and movement resumes. The question disappears with it. This pattern teaches that questions are dangerous. They introduce delay. Innocent monsters provoke questions simply by existing without hostility. Their removal reinforces the lesson that uncertainty must be eliminated quickly. Over time, this lesson becomes internalized. Characters anticipate the cost of questioning and suppress it preemptively. Innocent monsters are no longer recognized as morally ambiguous. They are processed as threats because treating them otherwise feels risky. Risk is narrowly defined. Physical risk is prioritized. Ethical risk is discounted. Innocent monsters pose ethical risk by challenging assumptions. The system undervalues this risk because it does not produce immediate harm. Long-term consequences are ignored. The long-term consequence is a universe that becomes increasingly hostile to gentleness. Innocent monsters disappear, leaving behind only those forms of life that can survive aggression. The multiverse becomes populated by beings shaped by conflict. This reinforces the belief that conflict is universal. This belief feeds back into behavior. If all life is hostile, preemptive violence feels justified. Innocent monsters, when they appear, are treated as exceptions that will soon prove the rule. Their brief existence does not alter the narrative. Narratives are powerful. They shape perception before experience can intervene. Innocent monsters are encountered within narratives that frame them as dangers. Their innocence contradicts the narrative. But narratives are resilient. They absorb contradiction by dismissing it as error. Error is attributed to perception rather than narrative. If a creature does not behave as expected, the assumption is not that the narrative is wrong, but that the observation is incomplete. Innocent monsters are misread as deceptive or delayed threats. This interpretation preserves narrative coherence. Preserving coherence is more important than accuracy. Accuracy requires revision. Revision is costly. Innocent monsters demand revision. The system avoids this cost by eliminating the demand. The creature is gone, and coherence remains intact. This avoidance does not eliminate doubt entirely. Doubt persists as background unease. Innocent monsters leave behind a sense that something was mishandled. This sense is vague and easily overridden. It does not crystallize into action. The inability of doubt to crystallize reflects the absence of accountability structures. There is no mechanism for reviewing encounters, no space for ethical audit. Innocent monsters are harmed in isolation without cumulative record. Each incident is forgotten as the next begins. Forgetting is essential to maintaining pace. Memory slows action. Innocent monsters are forgotten quickly. Their erasure is complete. The universe does not pause to mark loss. It moves on. This movement creates a rhythm. Encounter, classify, remove, continue. Innocent monsters are absorbed into this rhythm. Their presence does not alter tempo. The rhythm remains steady, efficient, and unreflective.